Sarah Chen was feeding her daughter breakfast when the sky caught fire. The first sign was the silence. Every bird in their small Tennessee town stopped singing at exactly 7:47 a.m. Then came the heat shimmer that wasn't quite heat, followed by the shadows that fell upward instead of down. 8-year-old Maya dropped her spoon into her cereal bowl and pointed at the window with the kind of certainty only children possess. "Mommy, the angels are angry." Sarah turned to look outside and felt her heart stop. The morning sky had become a canvas of impossible colors, deep purples that hurt to look at, greens that seemed to pulse with their own heartbeat, and threading through it all, a web of silver light that stretched from horizon to horizon like cracks in reality itself. In Tokyo, salary workers stopped mid-stride on busy sidewalks. In London, teacups slipped from trembling fingers in 1,000 different cafes. In São Paulo, children playing football abandoned their game to stare at the heavens. Across every continent, in every language, the same words were whispered: "They've come." The hegemony had finally arrived. For 3 decades, humanity had known this day was inevitable. Ever since the first radio telescope had picked up the alien transmissions, ever since the deep space observatories had detected the massive fleet moving through the outer rim of the galaxy like a plague of metal locusts, humanity had prepared for this moment. Governments had fallen and risen based on their preparedness plans. Scientists had worked around the clock to reverse engineer alien technology from the few crashed scouts humanity had managed to shoot down. Children had grown up learning evacuation procedures alongside their multiplication tables. But knowing something is coming and experiencing it are 2 different kinds of terror. The silver web in the sky began to pulse faster, and the air itself seemed to thicken. Sarah grabbed Maya's hand and pulled her away from the window just as every screen in their house activated simultaneously. The emergency broadcast system crackled to life, but instead of the familiar human voice they expected, something else spoke. The voice was harmony itself. Dozens of different tones weaving together into something that bypassed the ears and spoke directly to the brain. When it spoke, windows rattled, and somewhere in the distance, car alarms began screaming. "People of Earth," the voice said, and Sarah could hear the capital letters in its pronunciation. "You have been weighed by the eternal hegemony of united worlds and found wanting. Your species has committed the crime of aggressive expansion beyond your birth system. You have contaminated virgin worlds with your presence. You have altered the natural order of 17 star systems." Maya pressed closer to her mother, and Sarah wrapped her arms around her daughter's small shoulders. Down the street, she could see neighbors emerging from their houses, faces turned skyward with the same expression of helpless terror. "However," the voice continued, and something in its tone shifted. The harmony became more complex, with undertones Sarah couldn't quite identify. "The hegemony recognizes that your species was unaware of galactic law when these transgressions occurred. The Council of Minds has voted to extend a mercy that has been granted only 7 times in the history of our dominion. Around the world, humanity held its breath. You will have 1 rotation of your planet to demonstrate worthiness. Gather your greatest minds, your most accomplished leaders, your finest examples of what your species can become. Tomorrow, at this same moment, they will be judged. If they prove that humanity possesses the capacity for wisdom, for peaceful integration into galactic society, then your species will be granted protectorate status under hegemony law." Sarah felt a flicker of hope, but the voice wasn't finished. "If they fail to demonstrate this worthiness, your planet will be sterilized and your species will be remembered only as a cautionary tale. You have been shown mercy once, humans. Do not mistake this gift for weakness." The silver web in the sky pulsed once, brilliantly, and then faded. The impossible colors drained away, leaving behind ordinary blue sky that somehow looked less real than what had come before. Birds began singing again, tentatively, as if they too were trying to convince themselves that the world still made sense. Sarah's phone buzzed. Emergency alerts flooded in from every news service, every government agency, every social media platform, but she didn't need to read them to understand what had happened. Humanity had been granted a stay of execution, and they had exactly 24 hours to justify their continued existence.
Maya looked up at her with solemn eyes that seemed too old for her 8-year-old face.
"Are the angels still angry, Mommy?" "I really don't know." But even as she spoke the words, Sarah was thinking about her job at the Oak Ridge National Laboratory, about the project she'd been working on for the past 5 years. Project Memoria, they called it, an attempt to create a quantum storage system that could preserve human knowledge indefinitely. It had started as a way to back up humanity's accumulated learning in case of global catastrophe, but now it might be humanity's only hope of proving their worth to judges they couldn't even comprehend. Across the globe, similar thoughts were occurring to humanity's brightest minds in Geneva. Dr. Hassan Okafor was staring at his life's work on quantum consciousness transfer. In Beijing, Professor Liu Wei was reviewing her research on emotional resonance and artificial intelligence. In Boston, Dr. Robert Hayes was considering the implications of his breakthrough in temporal information storage. None of them knew it yet, but they were all working on pieces of the same impossible puzzle. The day progressed in a strange mixture of panic and determined calm. Governments around the world coordinated frantically, trying to decide who would represent humanity to the hegemony. Military leaders proposed showing strength. Diplomats suggested demonstrating cooperation. Scientists argued for displaying intellectual achievement. Artists insisted that culture and beauty were humanity's greatest gifts. But in small towns and big cities, in laboratories and living rooms, individual humans were making their own choices about what mattered most. Sarah spent the day at the lab working alongside colleagues who had all come in without being asked. They didn't talk much about what was happening. Instead, they focused on the work, on the clean equations and the precise measurements, on the comforting illusion that knowledge and skill and hard work could solve any problem. It was Dr. Yuki Tanaka who first spoke aloud what they were all thinking. She looked up from her computer screen where lines of code scrolled past like digital poetry and said quietly, "We're not going to impress them with our technology, are we? They cross the galaxy to get here. They make our ships look like paper airplanes." "No," Sarah agreed, not looking up from her own work. "But that's not what this is about." "Then what is it about?" asked Dr. Martinez, their team's youngest member. He was barely 30, brilliant enough to earn his doctorate at 25, and today he looked like a scared child trying to pretend he understood the adult world. Sarah finally looked up, meeting the eyes of her colleagues one by one. These were people she'd worked with for years, people whose minds she respected, whose friendship she treasured, people who, in 24 hours, might all be dead. "It's about remembering," she said. "They said they've shown mercy 7 times before. 7 other species got the same chance we're getting. I wonder what happened to them." "Doctor..." Tanaka's fingers stopped moving over her keyboard. "You think they failed the test?" "I think," Sarah said slowly, "that most species probably tried to impress their judges. They probably brought out their best scientists, their greatest leaders, their most advanced technology. They probably tried to prove they deserved to live. And that didn't work," Dr. Martinez said, understanding beginning to dawn in his eyes. "That's just another form of conquest," Sarah continued. "Another way of saying we're strong enough to survive. But that's not what mercy is about. Mercy isn't earned. It's given freely, or it's not mercy at all." The room fell silent as her words sank in. Outside, they could hear the distant sound of traffic, of a world trying to continue functioning while balanced on the edge of extinction. "So what do we do?" Dr. Tanaka asked finally. Sarah looked down at her hands, at the wedding ring she still wore 3 years after her husband's death, at the small scar on her thumb from helping Maya learn to ride a bicycle. Such tiny, insignificant marks, such enormous meaning. "We remember," she said. "We remember why mercy matters. And tomorrow, when they come to judge us, we show them what we chose to do with the gift they gave us." That night, Sarah went home to Maya and helped her daughter with homework that might never be turned in. They read stories together, books about brave princesses and clever mice and ordinary people who did extraordinary things when the world needed them most. When Maya finally fell asleep, Sarah sat by her daughter's window and looked up at a sky that seemed both infinite and fragile. Somewhere out there, beyond the stars she could see, ships larger than cities waited in the darkness. Beings with minds that could span galaxies were preparing to return and render judgment on everything Sarah had ever loved. But here, in this small room, in this small house, in a small town that was part of a small planet, orbiting an ordinary star, a mother was watching over her sleeping child. And somehow, despite everything that had happened and everything that might happen tomorrow, that felt like the most important thing in the universe. Sarah reached for her laptop and began to type. Not code, not equations, not scientific theories, just words. Simple words about what it meant to be human, about what it meant to love someone more than your own life, about what it meant to show kindness to strangers and mercy to enemies and hope in the face of impossible odds. She wrote about her daughter's laugh, about her late husband's terrible jokes, about the way Dr. Tanaka hummed while she worked, and the way Dr. Martinez always brought coffee for everyone when he came in early, and the way the whole team had stayed late to help Dr. sing when his daughter was sick, even though it meant missing their own deadlines. She wrote about ordinary miracles, about the small acts of grace that happened every day in every life, about the way humans could look at something broken and choose to fix it, look at something beautiful and choose to preserve it, look at something suffering and choose to heal it. As the night deepened and the words flowed, Sarah began to understand what humanity needed to show the hegemony. Not their strength, not their intelligence, not their potential for future greatness. They needed to show their capacity for remembering what mercy meant and their commitment to passing that memory on to anyone who would listen, including the species that had shown mercy to them. By dawn, Sarah had written 17 pages. When she read them back, they didn't seem like much, just the thoughts of one human woman trying to make sense of an incomprehensible situation. But somehow they felt right. They felt true. And truth, Sarah thought as she watched her daughter wake up to what might be their last morning together, might be the only thing that could save them now. The United Nations building had never seen anything like it. By noon on the Day of Judgment, representatives from every nation had arrived, but they weren't alone. Somehow word had spread through networks both official and underground, through academic conferences and social media posts, through whispered conversations and desperate phone calls. They came in chartered planes and borrowed cars, on buses and trains and ships that stretched the meaning of international law. They came because someone had shared a simple message that resonated across every culture. Bring your memories. Doctor. Sarah Chen stood in the General Assembly Hall and watched thousands of people file in. There were heads of state, yes, and Nobel laureates, and military leaders with chests full of decorations. But there were also kindergarten teachers and small-town librarians, war veterans and refugee camp workers, scientists and artists and farmers and mechanics. There were people who had survived genocides and people who had prevented them. There were children who spoke with the wisdom of the very old, and elderly individuals whose eyes still held the wonder of youth. They had come to remember and to be remembered. "This is madness," muttered General Harrison, the American military representative. He was a good man, Sarah had been told, someone who understood the weight of command and the price of difficult decisions. But today he looked lost. "We're supposed to be showing them our best and brightest, not running a global therapy session." "Are they mutually exclusive?" asked Dr. Amara Okonkwo, who had arrived that morning from Lagos with a delegation of historians and storytellers. She was small and elderly, with gray hair wrapped in colorful fabric and eyes that seemed to hold decades of patient wisdom. "Perhaps what makes us bright is our ability to remember why we choose to be good," the hall continued to fill. Translators worked frantically to accommodate languages from around the world, but Sarah noticed something interesting happening. People were beginning to communicate without translation, sharing photographs and sketches, using music and gesture and the universal language of human expression. A Japanese survivor of Hiroshima was showing pictures to a young Syrian refugee. A Maori elder was teaching traditional songs to a group of African children. An elderly rabbi was deep in conversation with a Buddhist monk and a Lakota medicine woman. "Look at them," said Dr. Heno. Elena Vasquez, who had flown in from Mexico City with a collection of handwritten letters from families who had been separated by immigration policies. "They're not preparing arguments. They're preparing stories." Through the massive windows of the assembly hall, the silver web was beginning to form again in the sky. But this time, humanity was ready for it. Not ready in the way armies prepare for battle, but ready in the way communities prepare for harvest, with patience, with purpose, with the understanding that some things cannot be rushed or forced. Sarah thought about the email she'd received that morning from her daughter's teacher. Maya had told her class about the angry angels, and somehow that had led to every child in the school writing letters to their families, just in case. 8-year-old letters full of crayon drawings and misspelled words and pure, unfiltered love. The teacher had asked if Sarah wanted copies, and Sarah had said yes, bring them all. Now she understood why. At exactly 2:30 p.m., the same harmonic voice that had spoken the day before resonated through every speaker system on Earth. But this time, the words came from above the assembly hall itself. "People of Earth, the time for judgment has arrived. Present your representatives to the hegemony for evaluation." Sarah looked around the packed hall and realized that no one was moving toward the speaking podium. No one was stepping forward to represent humanity to their alien judges. Instead, something else was happening. An old man in the front row stood up. He was wearing a simple black suit, and his hands shook slightly as he reached into his jacket pocket. Sarah could see from his delegate badge that he was listed as M. Goldstein, Holocaust survivor. New York. "I'm Max," he said, and his voice carried clearly through the hall's sound system. He didn't speak loudly, but the entire assembly fell silent to listen. "I was 7 years old when they came to take my family. I hid in a potato cellar for 3 days while my neighbors searched for me, not to turn me in, to help me. People I had never spoken to before risked their lives to save a little Jewish boy they didn't know. He pulled a small, worn photograph from his pocket. This is Katarzyna Nowak. She was a Polish Catholic who had lost her own son to the war. She found me in that cellar and told me I was her nephew visiting from Krakow. For 2 years, she fed me and hid me and loved me as her own child. When I had nightmares, she would sing me lullabies in a language I didn't understand. Max held up the photograph so the cameras could capture it. She died 3 weeks after the war ended. Pneumonia, because she had given me her winter coat. I never got to thank her properly. But I remember her. I have spent 70 years remembering her and telling her story and trying to be worthy of the mercy she showed me. He sat down, and for a moment the hall was completely silent. Then another person stood up. "I'm Fatima," said a woman in a colorful headscarf, speaking with a soft Somali accent. "During the Civil War, my village was attacked. A soldier, a child really, maybe 15 years old, found me hiding with my baby. He was supposed to kill us. Instead, he gave us water and told us where we could find safe passage out of the country. I never saw him again, but I name him in my prayers every night. His act of mercy saved 2 lives that night, and those 2 lives became 4, and those 4 became 8. Today I have 17 grandchildren because a child soldier chose compassion over duty." She remained standing as another voice joined hers, then another. Across the hall, people began to rise and speak. Not speeches or formal presentations, but simple stories. Personal moments when mercy had changed everything. Times when strangers had chosen kindness over indifference, when enemies had chosen forgiveness over revenge, when ordinary people had made extraordinary choices. Sarah heard stories that made her laugh and stories that made her cry. She heard about teachers who had stayed late to help struggling students, about doctors who had treated patients they couldn't afford to save, about neighbors who had shared their last meal with families they barely knew. She heard about soldiers who had refused orders to kill civilians, about pilots who had crashed their own planes rather than complete bombing runs, about ordinary citizens who had hidden refugees and fed the hungry and comforted the grieving. But most of all, she heard about memory. Story after story about people who had been shown mercy and who had spent their lives remembering that mercy, honoring it, trying to pass it on to others. A young girl, maybe 12 years old, stood up near the back of the hall. "I'm Anna from Sweden," she said in careful English. "Last year my family took in refugees from Syria. They didn't speak our language, and we didn't speak theirs, but we shared our house and our food because my grandmother always said that kindness is the only language everyone understands." She pulled out a small wooden carving. "Amir, the father, made this for me. It's a bird because he said I helped his family fly to safety. But I keep it because it reminds me that we are all just trying to find a safe place to land." An elderly indigenous woman spoke about treaties that were broken and promises that were kept. A former gang member talked about the social worker who had never given up on him. A refugee doctor described the nurse who had helped her learn English so she could continue practicing medicine in her new country. Hours passed, and the stories continued. Sarah began to realize that no one was directing this gathering. There was no schedule, no list of approved speakers, no carefully crafted message designed to impress their alien judges. Instead, humanity was doing what humans had always done in times of crisis. They were coming together to share their stories, to remember their connections, to affirm that their lives had meaning beyond individual survival, and, somewhere above them, listening through technology beyond human understanding, the hegemony was hearing something they had never heard before. Sarah finally stood up when the sun was beginning to set outside the windows. She looked around the hall at faces that had become familiar over the course of the day, at people who had traveled across the world to be here, at children and elderly individuals and everyone in between who had come to bear witness to humanity's greatest gift to itself, the ability to remember love. "I'm Sarah Chen," she said. "I'm a quantum physicist, but that's not why I'm here. I'm here because yesterday, when we were told we might die, my 8-year-old daughter asked me if the angels were still angry. And I realized that the question wasn't whether we deserve mercy. The question is whether we understand what mercy means, and whether we're willing to remember that understanding when we have the power to show mercy to others." She held up her laptop where she had stored hundreds of new stories from the past day. "We've been told that 7 other species have been given the same choice we were given. 7 other worlds have stood where we're standing now. I don't know what happened to them, but I know what we're doing differently. We're not trying to prove that we deserve to live. We're promising to remember that someone chose to let us live, and we're committing to honor that choice by showing the same mercy to others." Sarah looked up at the silver web that was beginning to pulse more rapidly in the darkening sky. You asked us to demonstrate worthiness. But worthiness can't be demonstrated in a day or a year or even a century. Worthiness is proven over time through small acts repeated daily, through choosing compassion when cruelty would be easier, through remembering kindness when hatred would be more satisfying. She gestured to the thousands of people around her. Every person in this room has a story about mercy they received or mercy they gave. Every person in this room carries memories that prove humanity is capable of growth, of change, of choosing to be better than our worst impulses. We're not asking you to trust in our potential. We're asking you to trust in our memory. The pulsing in the sky grew faster, and Sarah felt a familiar sensation, the feeling of being observed, evaluated, weighed by minds vast beyond human comprehension. But she wasn't afraid anymore. You showed us mercy once, she said, and her voice carried to every corner of the hall, to every camera and microphone that was broadcasting this moment around the world. We want to spend whatever time we have left showing mercy to others. We want to remember your gift and honor it by becoming the kind of species that gives such gifts freely. The silver web pulsed once, brilliantly, and then began to shift and change. The geometric patterns reformed themselves into something that looked almost like script, like writing in a language that bypassed human comprehension and spoke directly to human hearts. And in that moment, Sarah understood that the test had never been about proving their worthiness to live. It had been about proving their willingness to remember what it meant to let others live. As the alien script faded from the sky, Sarah felt a deep certainty settling in her chest. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new choices, new opportunities to choose mercy over vengeance, kindness over indifference, hope over despair. But tonight, humanity had remembered who they could choose to be. And somewhere in the vast network of ships that surrounded their small planet, beings with minds like galaxies were beginning to understand that they had found something unprecedented in their long history of judgment. They had found a species that wanted to become worthy of the mercy they had been shown. The test was over, but the real work was just beginning. 50 years after the Day of Judgment, the first stone was laid. Sarah Chen was 72 now, her hair silver but her eyes still bright with the same curiosity that had driven her through decades of quantum research. She stood in the Nevada desert alongside thousands of others, watching as the foundation ceremonies began for what would become the most ambitious construction project in human history. They called it the Memorial. Maya, now 58 and a professor of xenopsychology at the University of New Geneva, stood beside her mother with her own children clustered around her legs. 3 generations of the Chen family gathered to witness the beginning of something that would take 3 more generations to complete. "Tell us again about the angry angels, Grandma Sarah," whispered Maya's youngest daughter, 6-year-old Lynn, who had inherited her great-grandmother's gift for asking profound questions at inappropriate moments. Sarah smiled and knelt down to Lynn's level, her joints protesting only slightly. 5 decades of regular medical monitoring by hegemony biohealers had extended human lifespans considerably, but they hadn't eliminated the basic facts of aging. "They weren't angry, sweetheart," Sarah said, the same word she'd spoken hundreds of times over the years. "They were just careful. When someone is very powerful, they have to be careful about how they use that power. The hegemony had learned to be very, very careful." Around them, the ceremony continued. Representatives from all 47 species of the hegemony had come to witness this moment. The Zethli, tall and graceful, with their crystalline skin that chimed softly when they moved. The Mordani, whose gaseous bodies required specialized containment suits, but whose harmonious voices could express emotions humans didn't have words for. The ancient Veltar, who communicated through color shifts in their bioluminescent patches and had been traveling between stars since before Earth's sun was born. All of them had come to watch humanity begin building something unprecedented. "Dr. Chen," said a familiar voice behind her. Sarah turned to see High Counselor Velnash approaching, their forearms moving in the graceful gestures that served as formal greeting among their people. Velnash was Hegemony, one of the original species that had formed the Alliance 3 million years ago. They had been present at humanity's judgment 5 decades earlier, and had since become something like humanity's advocate within the Council of Minds. "High Counselor," Sarah replied, attempting the formal response gesture with her merely 2 arms. After 50 years of practice, she could almost manage it without looking clumsy. "I confess continued fascination with your species' response to integration," Velnash said, their translated words carrying undertones of genuine puzzlement. 46 species have been granted protectorate status in hegemony history. All have focused their efforts on advancing their technology, expanding their territory, increasing their representation within the council. You are the first to dedicate your primary resources to remembrance. Sarah looked out at the construction site, where humans and aliens worked side by side using technology that merged hegemony engineering with human craftsmanship. The memorial would be massive when completed, a structure that could be seen from orbit, containing within it the preserved memories of every act of mercy, every moment of grace, every choice to show kindness rather than cruelty that had been recorded in human history, and not just human history. Over the past 5 decades, as word of the memorial project had spread throughout hegemony space, other species had begun contributing their own memories. Stories of compassion from worlds whose names humans couldn't pronounce, acts of mercy committed by beings whose psychology was utterly alien to human understanding. "High Counselor," Sarah said carefully, "may I ask you something that has puzzled me for 50 years? Velnash's color patches shifted to indicate polite curiosity. "Of course. The 7 species that came before us, the ones who were offered the same choice we were given. What happened to them?" For a long moment, Velnash was silent. When they finally spoke, their words were translated with unusual hesitation, as if the concepts were difficult to render in human language. "They chose to prove their worthiness," Velnash said, "each in their own way. The Keith Mori demonstrated their scientific achievements, the Zerani displayed their artistic accomplishments, the Velmoth showed their military prowess, the Handtech revealed their philosophical sophistication, the Zarek presented their technological innovations, the Morthek exhibited their mathematical insights. The Kalvani attempted to prove their strategic value to the hegemony." Sarah waited, sensing there was more to the story. "All were adequate," Velnash continued, their patches shifting to colors that suggested deep discomfort. "All demonstrated capabilities that would have been useful to the hegemony. All were granted protectorate status and welcomed into galactic society." "But?" Sarah prompted. "But none of them understood what they had been given," Velnash said quietly. "They treated mercy as a transaction to be repaid, rather than a gift to be honored. They sought to prove themselves worthy of survival, rather than becoming worthy of the trust that had been placed in them," Sarah finished. Velnash's patches flashed bright green, the equivalent of a surprised blink. "Yes, precisely." "They survived, but they did not grow. They advanced technologically, expanded territorially, increased their influence within the Council, but they remained essentially unchanged by the experience of being shown mercy." Sarah looked around at the construction site where her species was building something that would serve no strategic purpose, advance no territorial claims, demonstrate no technological superiority. A monument to remembrance, to the simple acknowledgement that they had been given a gift too precious to forget. "What happened to them?" she asked. "Those 7 species, where are they now?" Velnash's pattern shifted to deep blue, the color of ancient sadness. "They exist. They are members of the hegemony in good standing. They contribute to council decisions and participate in galactic commerce and maintain their territories according to established protocols. But they're not really alive anymore, are they?" Sarah said, understanding beginning to dawn. "They're going through the motions of existence, but they've forgotten why existence matters." "The hegemony has become very efficient over 3 million years," Velnash said. "Very organized, very careful. We have protocols for everything, procedures for every contingency, established methods for maintaining order across a galaxy, but efficiency is not the same as vitality, and order is not the same as growth." Sarah thought about her own life over the past 50 years. Humanity's integration into galactic society had not been easy. They had made mistakes, misunderstood customs, accidentally offended entire species with well-intentioned gestures that carried unintended meanings, but they had learned, adapted, grown in ways that surprised even themselves. More importantly, they had changed the hegemony in return. "Dr. Chen," Velnash said hesitantly, "may I share something that may be inappropriate for me to discuss?" Sarah nodded, curious about what could make a being with 3 million years of diplomatic experience uncertain about protocol. "The Council of Minds has been different since your species' integration, more varied in their deliberations, more willing to consider alternatives to established procedures. Last cycle, the Zerani, one of the 7 species I mentioned, requested permission to contribute memories to your memorial project." Sarah's eyebrows rose. "What kind of memories?" Acts of mercy they had received but forgotten to honor, moments of grace they had experienced but failed to preserve. They wished to remember what they had allowed themselves to forget. The implications hit Sarah like a physical force. "It's spreading," Yes, Vilnash confirmed, their patterns now shifting between colors that indicated both hope and concern. 16 species have made similar requests. The concept of the memorial, of preserving and honoring mercy rather than simply acknowledging it, has begun to resonate throughout hegemony space. Sarah looked out at the construction site with new eyes. What had begun as humanity's response to a moment of cosmic grace was becoming something larger, a galactic awakening to the importance of remembering why mercy mattered. "Hi, Counselor," she said slowly. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Are we changing the fundamental nature of the hegemony?" Velnash's patches went through a rapid series of colors before settling on a pattern Sarah had never seen before, something that her translation implant couldn't interpret. Dr. H.E. said, "Chen," Velnash said finally, "the hegemony has existed for 3 million years. In all that time, we have maintained order, preserved peace, prevented the chaos and destruction that plagued the galaxy before our formation. We have become very good at survival." They paused, watching as a group of human children played with young Mordani cloudlings, their laughter mixing with harmonic chimes in a sound that was beautiful despite being utterly impossible. "But survival was never supposed to be the end goal," Velnash continued. "It was supposed to be the foundation for something greater. The hegemony was created to preserve life so that life could flourish, grow, discover new ways of being. Somewhere in our 3 million years of careful efficiency, we lost sight of that purpose." Sarah felt a chill of understanding. "You're saying that the hegemony was dying." "Not dying," Velnash corrected, "fossilizing. Becoming a perfect, unchanging monument to what we once were, rather than a living system capable of becoming something new." They gestured toward the Memorial's foundation, where humans and aliens worked together on something that had never existed before. Not just a building, but a new way of thinking about the relationship between memory and growth, between preservation and progress. It is a choice to be renewed, moment by moment, decision by decision. And that choice requires memory, not just of what we have received, but of why it mattered. As if summoned by their conversation, Maya approached with her children in tow. "Mom, they're about to start the foundation ceremony. They want you to speak." Sarah looked around at the assembled thousands, humans and aliens alike, all gathered to witness the beginning of something unprecedented. She thought about the long journey that had brought them to this moment, about the choice her species had made 50 years ago to remember mercy rather than simply benefit from it. "What should I tell them?" she asked Velnash. The High Counselor's patches shifted to warm gold, a color that conveyed deep affection and respect. "Tell them what your species has taught the galaxy, Dr. Chen. That being worthy of mercy is not about what you accomplish. It is about what you remember." Sarah nodded and walked toward the speaking platform, her family and her alien friend following behind her. In a few minutes, she would address the crowd, officially beginning the construction of a monument that would take generations to complete. But the real monument, she realized, was not the building they were about to construct. The real monument was the choice to remember, not just humanity's choice, but the choice of an entire galactic civilization to rediscover what it meant to show grace to others. The memorial would be magnificent when it was finished, but the memory it preserved was already changing the galaxy. And that, Sarah thought as she stepped up to the podium, was exactly what mercy was supposed to do. 150 years after the Day of Judgment, the memorial sang. Lin Chen Okafor stood at the heart of the completed structure, her aged hands resting on the resonance core, a crystalline matrix that held within it the preserved memories of 10 billion acts of mercy from across the galaxy. At 96, she was one of the last humans who had been alive when construction began, though the hegemony's longevity treatments meant she might live to see another century. The memorial had grown far beyond anything the original architects had imagined. What had started as humanity's monument to remembering mercy had become a living ecosystem of galactic consciousness. Species from across hegemony space had contributed not just memories, but entire philosophical frameworks for understanding compassion, forgiveness, and growth. The structure itself defied easy description. Rising from the Nevada desert like a mountain of crystallized starlight, its walls were composed of a hybrid material that existed simultaneously in normal space and quantum dimensions. Visitors could walk through corridors lined with memory crystals, each one containing the preserved experience of a moment when someone had chosen kindness over cruelty, understanding over judgment, hope over despair. But that wasn't the remarkable part. The remarkable part was that the memorial was teaching the galaxy to dream. Grandmother Lin, said her great-great-granddaughter Zara, whose genetic profile bore markers from 5 different species, thanks to humanity's gradual integration into galactic society. The Velter Collective is requesting another memory consultation. They say their young ones are beginning to experience something they've never encountered before. Lynn smiled, though the expression carried undertones of concern. The Veltar were one of the galaxy's oldest species, with a collective consciousness that spanned millions of individual bodies. For 3 million years, their society had operated with perfect efficiency, each individual mind contributing to a greater whole without conflict, doubt, or uncertainty. Until 6 months ago, when young Veltar had begun reporting dreams, individual dreams, personal visions that belonged to single minds rather than the collective consciousness. Dreams filled with images of mercy, kindness, and individual choice, concepts that had no meaning within their society's perfect unity. It was happening across the galaxy. Species that had achieved perfect order were experiencing spontaneous outbreaks of compassion. Civilizations built on logical efficiency were discovering the illogical beauty of forgiveness. The memorial's influence was spreading like a quantum virus, awakening something in galactic consciousness that had been dormant for millions of years. "Send my regards to the collective," Lynn said, "and tell them I'll review their case files tonight. But first I need to speak with High Counselor Velnash." Velnash had aged remarkably little in the century and a half since humanity's judgment, but their color patterns had grown more complex, shifting through hues that hadn't existed in their species' emotional vocabulary before contact with humans. Today, as they materialized via quantum teleportation in Lynn's private office, their patches displayed a swirling mixture of excitement, concern, and something that Lynn's translation implant identified as temporal vertigo. "Dr. Chen Okafor," Velnash said, their formal greeting gesture somehow managing to convey both respect and barely controlled panic. "I must speak with you about a matter of galactic importance." "The awakening," Lynn said simply. Velnash's patterns shifted to surprise, then relief. "You understand what is happening?" "I've been monitoring the reports from across hegemony space," Lynn confirmed. 43 species experiencing spontaneous development of individual consciousness. 17 civilizations reporting outbreaks of what they're calling empathy disease. The Corinth hive mind has formally requested assistance in dealing with their first recorded case of civil disobedience. One of their warrior drones refused an order to execute prisoners of war. She gestured toward her office's viewing portal, which displayed a real-time image of the memorial's central chamber. Beings from hundreds of species moved through the space, some alone, others in groups, all engaging with the preserved memories in ways their cultures had never conceived of before. "The memorial isn't just preserving memories of mercy anymore," Lynn continued. "It's teaching the galaxy to remember what mercy feels like. And once you remember feeling something, you start wanting to feel it again." "The Council of Minds is in emergency session," Velnash said, their patterns now displaying pure anxiety. "Some members believe the memorial has become a threat to galactic stability. They argue that the awakening of individual consciousness could lead to the collapse of collective societies, the breakdown of efficient governance, the return of chaos that the hegemony was formed to prevent." Lynn had been expecting this conversation for months. The signs had been building gradually. Increased security around the memorial, subtle restrictions on interspecies communication, carefully worded suggestions that humanity might want to consider moderating the memorial's influence. "They want to shut it down," she said. "Not shut down," Velnash corrected quickly. "Contain. Limit its influence to willing participants. Prevent the spontaneous transmission of memory experiences to species that haven't specifically requested them." Lynn stood and walked to her office's memorial wall, where thousands of small crystals held the preserved memories of her own family's experiences. Her great-great-great-grandmother Sarah's memories of the Day of Judgment, her grandmother Maya's recollections of the memorial's construction, her own childhood experiences of learning to communicate with alien minds, and newer memories, too. Zara's first friendship with a Mordani cloudling, her nephew's wedding to a Zethli artist, the first recorded human-Zethli union in galactic history. Small moments of connection that would have been impossible before the memorial taught the galaxy to remember why differences could be beautiful rather than threatening. "High Counselor," Lynn said quietly, "may I show you something?" She activated a wall display that connected directly to the memorial's central database. The screen filled with a complex web of interconnected points, each representing a species, civilization, or individual mind that had been touched by the memorial's influence. "This is the awakening map," Lynn explained. "Each connection represents a moment when someone learned to choose mercy over efficiency, understanding over order, growth over stability. The web was vast and growing, with new connections appearing in real time as beings across the galaxy continued to discover new ways of relating to themselves and others. Look at the pattern, Len continued. The awakening isn't random. It's not chaos. It's evolution. Velnash studied the display, their patterns shifting through colors that indicated deep thought. Evolution toward what? Toward what the hegemony was supposed to become 3 million years ago, Lin said. A galactic civilization capable of growth rather than just maintenance. A society that preserves life not just to prevent death, but to enable flourishing. She manipulated the display to show historical data, highlighting the periods of greatest innovation and discovery in hegemony history. Every major advancement in galactic civilization has come from species that maintained individual consciousness alongside collective cooperation. The hegemony's greatest achievements happened when different perspectives collaborated, not when uniform minds reached efficient consensus. But the stability, Velnash protested, the peace we've maintained for 3 million years. Individual consciousness led to war, to conflict, to the chaos that nearly destroyed the galaxy before the hegemony's formation. Did it? Lin challenged. Or did the absence of mercy lead to war? Did the failure to remember why others matter lead to conflict? She called up another data stream, this one showing the memorial's impact on interspecies conflicts over the past century. Disputes resolved through understanding rather than force, up 4,000%. Wars prevented through diplomatic innovation, up 1,200%. Species choosing cooperation over competition, up 600%. The numbers were staggering, and Velnash's pattern shifted to amazement as they processed the implications. The awakening isn't creating chaos, Lin continued. It's teaching the galaxy to choose order through understanding rather than impose order through control. There's a difference between peace that comes from fear and peace that comes from love. A soft chime indicated an incoming priority communication. Lin activated the receiver and found herself looking at the concerned faces of several council members, their various physiologies united in expressions of deep worry. Dr. Chen Okafor spoke Council Prime Zethrak, whose species had been instrumental in founding the hegemony. We understand you are discussing the situation with High Counselor Velnash. We must ask for your cooperation in limiting the memorial's influence until the Council can determine appropriate safeguards. Lin looked around her office, at the crystals holding her family's memories, at the displays showing the galaxy learning to choose mercy, at the images of beings from hundreds of species discovering new ways to connect with each other. Council Prime, she said respectfully, I need to ask you the same question my great-great-great-grandmother asked High Admiral Zethkai 150 years ago. What do you think mercy means? The council members exchanged glances, or the equivalent appropriate to their various sensory systems. Mercy is the strategic decision to preserve life when elimination would be more efficient, Zethrak replied. No, Lin said gently, that's policy. Mercy is the choice to remember that life has value beyond its utility to you. She gestured toward the awakening map, where new connections continued to form across the galaxy. The memorial isn't teaching species to abandon order. It's teaching them to choose order that serves life rather than order that controls it. Councilmember Korthvex, whose crystalline body rang like distant bells as they shifted nervously, spoke next. But the unpredictability, individual consciousness leads to individual choices, which lead to unforeseen consequences. Yes, Lin agreed. And those unforeseen consequences include innovation, creativity, growth, and the discovery of new forms of beauty. They also include the possibility of conflict, but a conflict that can be resolved through understanding rather than elimination. She called up one final display, a real-time view of the memorial's current activity. Thousands of beings moved through the structure, but they weren't just passively experiencing preserved memories anymore. They were creating new ones, sharing their own stories of mercy and growth, contributing to an ever-expanding library of galactic consciousness. The awakening can't be stopped, Lin said simply. Not because we won't let you, but because you can't unlearn what you've learned. You can't unfeel what you felt. Once a civilization remembers what it means to choose mercy, that memory becomes part of who they are. Velnash suddenly straightened, their patterns flashing through a rapid sequence that indicated sudden understanding. The 7 species, they said. The ones who came before humanity. They never truly integrated into the hegemony because they never learned to value what they had been given. They remained separate, isolated, going through the motions, but never truly alive. And now? Lin prompted. Now they're requesting memory consultations. All of them. They want to learn what they forgot how to feel. The council members fell silent, processing the implications. Finally, Zethrak spoke again. their voice carrying a note of something that Lin's translator interpreted as wonder. Dr. Chen Okafor, are you suggesting that the memorial represents not a threat to galactic stability, but a return to our original purpose? Lin smiled, thinking of her ancestor Sarah, who had chosen to remember mercy rather than demand justice. Council Prime, I'm suggesting that stability without growth is just another form of death. The galaxy is learning to be alive again. She looked around at the assembled leaders of galactic civilization, beings with minds vast beyond human comprehension, yet somehow still capable of learning something new about what it meant to choose kindness. The awakening isn't something happening to the galaxy, Lin said. It's something the galaxy is choosing to become, and that choice, renewed moment by moment, across billions of worlds, is exactly what mercy was always meant to create. The communication ended, leaving Lin and Velnash alone in the office overlooking the memorial. Outside, the sun was setting over the Nevada desert, painting the quantum crystal walls with colors that shifted between dimensions. What happens next? Velnash asked. Lin reached out and touched one of her family's memory crystals, feeling the warm resonance of preserved love and hope and determination. Next, we keep remembering. We keep choosing mercy. We keep helping the galaxy learn that the most important things can't be calculated or controlled. They can only be felt and shared and honored. And if the Council decides to restrict the memorial's influence, Lin smiled, looking out at the thousands of beings still moving through the structure, still learning, still growing, still choosing to become more than they had been. Then they'll discover that some gifts, once given, can never be taken back. The galaxy has learned to remember mercy. That memory is part of who we are now. The memorial sang around them, its crystalline voice carrying the preserved echoes of 10 billion choices to be kind, to forgive, to hope. And in response, the galaxy sang back, creating new harmonies that had never existed before. The awakening was just beginning. 300 years after the Day of Judgment, the hegemony no longer existed. In its place was something that had no name in any single language, because it required the combined linguistic efforts of 700 species to describe. The humans, with their talent for simplifying complex concepts, had started calling it the symphony, because what had once been a rigid hierarchy of control had become a vast, collaborative composition of countless voices contributing to a single, ever-evolving song. Captain Elena Chen Vashmorthai stood on the observation deck of the exploration vessel Mercy's Gift, watching as her ship approached the edge of known space. At her side stood her bondmate, Kresh Tal of the Veltar Collective, whose individual consciousness had awakened during the Great Transformation 2 centuries earlier. Their children, biological and adopted, human and alien and hybrid, clustered around them, excited by the prospect of first contact with a previously unknown civilization. Elena was the first captain in galactic history to command a ship crewed entirely by volunteers from species that had once been enemies. Her first officer was a descendant of the original hegemony founders. Her chief engineer was from a species that had been conquered by the old hegemony and forcibly integrated. Her communication specialist belonged to a collective consciousness that had learned to value individual creativity. Her navigator had been born in the space between stars, the child of parents from 6 different worlds. Together they explored the galaxy not to conquer or control, but to discover and welcome whatever they might find. "Contact in 30 seconds, announced Zira, their Corinth pilot. Her people had been the hegemony's most feared warriors, bred for perfect obedience and merciless efficiency. Now they were known throughout the galaxy as the finest diplomats, their warrior instincts redirected toward protecting peace rather than imposing order. Elena nodded and activated the ship's memory core, a direct descendant of the original memorial's technology. Every exploration vessel in the symphony carried such a core containing the preserved experiences of mercy, kindness, and growth that had transformed galactic civilization. When they encountered new species, their first gift was not technology or alliance offers, but the simple sharing of memory. Here is what it means to choose compassion over conquest. "The unknown vessel is responding to our greeting," reported Tisla, their communication specialist. The young Mordani's gaseous form shimmered with excitement, her translated voice carrying harmonics that expressed wonder and hope. They're terrified. Their transmissions indicate they believe we'd come to destroy them." Elena felt her heart clench with familiar pain. Even after 3 centuries, first contact with new species was often shadowed by fear. The galaxy was vast, and not every civilization had learned the lessons of mercy. There were still corners of space where the old patterns persisted, where strength was measured by the ability to destroy, where difference was seen as threat, where mercy was considered weakness. Standard protocols, Elena said softly. Show them who we choose to be. The Mercy's gift stopped its approach and began transmitting what had become known throughout the galaxy as the humanity signal, a combination of music, mathematics, and preserved memories that told the story of a small blue world that had been shown mercy and had spent centuries learning to honor that gift. But this time, something was different. Captain, Zira said, her patterns shifting to colors that indicated confusion mixed with awe. They're not just receiving our transmission, they're adding to it. The main display activated, showing the unknown vessel, organic-looking craft that seemed to be grown rather than built. As they watched, the ship began to emit its own signals, complex harmonics that wove themselves into the humanity signal like a new voice joining a familiar song. They're sharing their own memories, Thisla whispered. Memories of mercy, memories of choosing kindness over conquest. Elena leaned forward, studying the data streams. Are you saying they've already learned these lessons? More than that, Kreshtal said, their individual minds speaking through the quantum link they shared with the collective. The patterns are familiar, but ancient. These aren't recent developments, these are cultural foundations that stretch back millions of years. A new possibility began to form in Elena's mind, one that made her pulse quicken with excitement and disbelief. Open a communication channel. Full translation matrix. The screen flickered, and then they were looking at beings unlike any they had encountered before. They were tall and graceful, with features that seemed to shift subtly as they moved, as if their bodies were as much energy as matter. But their eyes held the same quality Elena had seen in the oldest memory crystals from the original memorial. The look of beings who had learned to remember love. Greetings, travelers from distant stars, the lead being said, their voice carrying harmonics that spoke of vast age and deeper wisdom. We are the ancients of Veltara. We welcome you to the edge of what you call the known galaxy. Elena felt her hands trembling as she responded. Greetings, ancients. I am Captain Elena Chen Vashmortai of the vessel Mercy's Gift. We come in friendship and hope. The ancient inclined their head gracefully. We know of your vessel's name, Captain. We know of your symphony. We know of the transformation that began 300 years ago on a small world at the edge of what was then called the hegemony. You've been watching us, Elena realized. We have been waiting, the ancient corrected gently. Waiting for the galaxy to remember what we had almost given up hope it could learn. The implications hit Elena like a physical force. You're the ones who showed mercy to Earth. One of us was, the ancient confirmed. Admiral Zethkai was young then, by our standards. Barely 5,000 years old. When he encountered your species, he saw something that resonated with our oldest teachings, the potential for growth through remembrance, for strength through kindness. Elena's mind raced, trying to process what she was hearing. The hegemony, the original hegemony, wasn't your creation. The hegemony was our children's creation, the ancient said, and Elena could hear sadness in their harmonics. When we first began exploring the galaxy, we encountered chaos, warfare, suffering beyond description. We tried to impose order through wisdom, but wisdom cannot be forced. We tried to teach mercy through example, but example is only effective for those willing to learn. The display shifted to show historical records, images of the early galaxy before the hegemony's formation. Elena saw wars that spanned entire star systems, genocides that eliminated entire species, a cosmos that seemed determined to tear itself apart through hatred and fear. So our children chose a different path, the ancient continued. They created the hegemony, a system that could impose peace through strength, maintain order through control. It was not the galaxy we had dreamed of, but it was better than the chaos that had come before. But it wasn't enough, Elena said, understanding beginning to dawn. For 3 million years, the hegemony maintained stability, but stability without growth is merely delayed death. Our children's empire preserved life, but forgot why life was worth preserving. The display showed the slow decline of galactic civilization, technological advancement without spiritual growth, expansion without purpose, order without joy, a galaxy going through the motions of existence but forgetting what existence was for. Then you encountered Earth, Elena said. Then Admiral Zethkai encountered a small blue world where beings had learned to choose mercy even in the face of their own destruction, the ancient confirmed. And he remembered what we had tried to teach the galaxy millions of years ago, that the greatest strength comes from the choice to preserve rather than destroy. Aelin looked around at her crew, beings from dozens of species, all united not by force or law, but by shared commitment to choosing kindness over cruelty, understanding over judgment, growth over stagnation. The memorial. She realized it wasn't just preserving human memories of mercy, it was rediscovering your original vision for what the galaxy could become. Your species did something unprecedented, the ancients said, their voice carrying notes of wonder that transcended translation. You received mercy and chose to honor it rather than exploit it. You built a monument not to your own worthiness, but to the worthiness of the gift you had received. The display shifted again, showing the spread of the awakening across galactic space. Elena watched as the rigid structures of the old hegemony transformed into the flowing collaborative networks of the symphony. She saw species learning to value individual consciousness alongside collective wisdom. She saw civilizations choosing cooperation over domination, growth over control. The transformation exceeded our most optimistic projections, the ancient continued. Within 2 centuries, the galaxy had not only achieved the harmony we had dreamed of 3 million years ago, but had surpassed it. Your symphony represents something new, a form of galactic consciousness that preserves both unity and diversity, both stability and growth. Elena felt tears forming in her eyes. You've been waiting all this time, watching, hoping. We are old, Captain. Older than most stars in this galaxy. We have seen civilizations rise and fall, watched species discover wisdom and forget it, witnessed the endless cycles of growth and decay that mark the passage of cosmic time. The ancient's expression shifted to something that Elena's translation matrix interpreted as profound gratitude, but we have never seen what your species accomplished. We have never witnessed an entire galaxy learning to remember love. What happens now? Elena asked. What do you want from us? The ancient smiled, an expression that somehow conveyed the joy of countless eons of patient hope finally fulfilled. Nothing, dear child. You have already given us everything we dared to dream of. A galaxy that chooses mercy not because it is forced to, but because it understands that mercy is what makes existence worthwhile. But surely, Elena began. We are tired, the ancient said gently. We have carried the responsibility of galactic consciousness for millions of years. We have watched over the cosmos like gardeners tending a vast field, hoping that someday the seeds we planted would grow into something beautiful. The display showed images of the ancients' own civilization, cities of light that spanned entire systems, beings of incredible wisdom and power who had chosen to dedicate their existence to nurturing life throughout the galaxy. The symphony no longer needs gardeners, the ancient continued. It has learned to tend itself, to grow in directions we never imagined, to create forms of beauty and meaning that exceed our ancient dreams. Elena suddenly understood what the ancient was saying. You're leaving. We are joining, the ancient corrected. For 3 million years, we have stood apart from the galaxy we tried to guide. Now, thanks to your species' gift of remembrance, we can finally become part of the symphony rather than conducting it from a distance. The screen filled with light as the ancient vessel began to transform, its organic structure opening like a flower to reveal not a ship, but a living being of impossible size and beauty. Other lights appeared throughout the surrounding space. Dozens, then hundreds, then thousands of similar beings, each one an ancient who had spent eons waiting for this moment. We gift to you our memories, the ancients said, their voice now joined by the harmonics of their entire people. Millions of years of wisdom, of watching, of learning. But more than that, we gift to you our joy at seeing what your galaxy has become. The light from the ancient's transformation reached the Mercy's gift, and Elena felt her ship's memory core expanding, filling with experiences beyond human comprehension. But underneath the vast cosmic awareness, she found something wonderfully familiar, the same simple joy that had filled the first memory crystals in the original memorial. The joy of choosing to be kind, the joy of remembering love. Thank you, Elena whispered, speaking for her crew, her ship, her species, and the entire symphony that had grown from a single moment of mercy shown to a small blue world. Thank you, the ancients replied, their voices fading as they dispersed into the quantum field that connected all consciousness throughout the galaxy. Thank you for remembering what we had almost forgotten ourselves, that the greatest gift we can give is not our power, but our trust. The light faded, leaving the Mercy's gift alone at the edge of known space. But not truly alone. Elena could feel the presence of the ancients woven into the quantum fabric of reality itself, part of the vast invisible network that connected every conscious being in the galaxy. Captain, Zira said softly, we're receiving a transmission from Symphony Central. They want to know what we found. Elena looked around at her crew, at beings from dozens of worlds united by shared commitment to choosing mercy over conquest, kindness over cruelty, growth over stagnation. She thought about the long journey that had brought them here, from a small town in Tennessee where a mother had held her daughter and wondered if angels were angry, to this moment at the edge of the galaxy where those angels had revealed themselves to be gardeners waiting for their garden to bloom. "Tell them," Elena said, her voice carrying harmonics that her crew's translation matrices interpreted as infinite love, "that we've found our way home." And in the quantum field that connected all consciousness throughout the galaxy, in the living memory of the symphony that had grown from humanity's choice to honor mercy, the story continued to unfold. New species were discovered and welcomed. New forms of consciousness emerged and were embraced. New ways of choosing kindness were invented and shared. The galaxy sang with voices beyond counting, each one unique, each one precious, each one part of a vast composition that had no end because it was always growing, always learning, always finding new ways to remember that love was the only force in the universe stronger than death. And at the heart of it all, preserved in quantum crystal and living memory, the simple truth that had started everything. Mercy is not something you earn. It is something you choose to remember and honor and pass on to others. The angels had never been angry. They had been waiting for the galaxy to learn how to sing. Now the song would never end.